Good morning. So I'd like to share with you a PowerPoint presentation focusing on the relationship between dreams, mythology, and the arts, with special reference to the curriculum of the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. So I'm going to do that by sharing my screen. I am Evans Lansing Smith, the chair of the Mythological Studies program at the Pacifica Graduate Institute. And the title of my presentation is The Night Sea Journey, which comes from a phrase developed by an anthropologist named Leo Frobenius about the journey of the sun through the darkness of the night and the encounter with what you might call the demons of the deep and the subsequent sunrise at dawn. This became a basic metaphor that Jung adopted in 1912 or so when he wrote his important breakaway book, Symbols of Transformation. And it became a metaphor essentially for the Jungian process of individuation, the descent into the darkness of the night and the activation of the deep archetypal energies of the psyche. And engaging in relationship with those energies effected a fundamental transformation of the personality associated with the process of individuation. So to begin with, I'd like to emphasize the multicultural nature, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary nature of mythological studies. At the center of this little diagram here, you'll see the subject of myth, and by myth, I'm referring to the great traditions of world mythology from a wide range of different cultures, from the Greco-Roman to the Native American, Hindu and Buddhist, and so forth. And the approach to the interpretation and the engagement with myth brings together all of the liberal arts and the humanities-based curriculum, such as those which you will see here on this screen. And the approach to mythology and the classes and the way that we teach them essentially embraces elements of all of these various disciplines of the humanities curriculum. And it's informed, of course, by the great traditions of depth psychology coming out of the schools of Jung and von Franz and on up into the post-Jungian world of archetypal psychology with James Hillman. And the essence of the Jungian approach to dream is what we call amplification. When you have an image in a dream and you bring to the table in the conversation as many mythological associations as you can summon and move towards an interpretation of the dream if this were an analytical process, and then apply it to one's life or the life of one's client. And I'd like to demonstrate that today by sharing a dream and amplifying it with reference to the iconographies from a wide range of mythologies, such as the ones I have listed here on the bottom, bringing into the conversation Greek, Nordic, Egyptian, alchemical, and even African mythologies with reference to the imagery of the dream, revolving around a handful of central archetypal universal themes that emerge in the domain of myth and dream. And they involve the night sea journey, the battle with the dragon, imagery of whirlpools, mermaids, and sirens, and very importantly, the symbolism of clothing with investiture and divestiture, putting clothing on and taking clothing off. Very important motif in a wide range of important mythologies. So let me begin with the dream itself, which I'd like to share with you. It's one of my own dreams from when I was 26 years old. And I share it to show the way in which dream and myth have primarily to do with the dynamic of life and the certain dramatic developments and creative transformations that can occur when we engage in a deep way with the imagery of dreams. So this is a dream that I had when I had essentially begun a sort of a hero journey, uh, following the model of Joseph Campbell, feeling the need to find some other way of doing things, and leaving home for a journey that would take me eventually to Ireland and to London for a year and a half, working on a novel and a collection of poems with Antioch International and a creative writing program. And as often the case with the hero journey cycle, there's a call to adventure, as Campbell puts it. And this can occur in a lot of different ways. It can be an external call, such as being drafted into the army, or it can be an internal psychological crisis or a domestic problem, which leads to a departure from home and a journey to find a new way, a new life, a creative dynamic to one's life. And this was the case for me, essentially turning away from the career paths that would have been typical for someone with my background, and moving towards the arts and literature and a deeper engagement with the psyche, coming out of a series of childhood traumas that are relevant to the dream. So this dream begins in a little marina on the coast of Western England in Wales, in Holyhead, where you pick up the ferry that takes you across the legendary Irish Sea to Dublin. And this was, in fact, the journey that I had taken before this dream. And during the journey, met a very important friend from the part of Maryland that I grew up in, a lovely young woman whom I call my Lady of the Manor. And she will be an important figure as we move now into the dream. The dream is set at nighttime, and I'm getting on the ferry, and the ferry has gone out through the seawall and is just moving into the open sea at night. And as it does so, in the dream, the boat hits something with a tremendous impact and a tremor that goes through the whole boat. And eventually in the dream, it becomes clear that what happened is that the boat has sliced through a gigantic sea serpent or dragon. And as a result, there is a whirlpool, a maelstrom, as the boat slowly begins to spin around after having cut through this gigantic sea serpent. And it generates a whirlpool. And I go over to the edge of the boat on the railings and look down into the depths of the whirlpool, in which I see blood and foam and drowning sailors. And way down at the bottom of the whirlpool, there emerges a young woman, a naked young woman. And I reach down over the side of the boat and bring her up onto the deck. And in so doing, I notice that she's got very scaly skin. Her thighs have huge goose pimple-like scales on them. And she's naked. So the crew comes to take her away. And when she's brought back, she's dressed in the clothing of the young woman from Maryland that I had met in real life during the crossing of the Irish Sea. And that's the end of the dream, which would lead eventually to the subject matter for the first poem that I wrote during that summer at the Divinity Hostel outside of Dublin in the creative writing program. So I'd like to dwell on the imagery of that dream and show how an engagement with the imagery of dream opens up to the rich world of comparative mythology when seen through the lens of Jungian depth psychology using the dynamic principle of interpretation based on amplification of archetypal motifs. And this is a little quotation from Jung that identifies the night sea journey as a descent into the underworld, a journey to the land of the ghosts and the spirits, domain of the ancestors, but particularly an immersion in the deep unconscious and the activation of the archetypal imagery that connects the world of the dream to that of the collective psyche of world mythology. And in that context, the night sea journey is a very important motif, and it often does involve an encounter with the dragon or a sea monster, and a battle that occurs in the iconographies of world mythology with some of the key figures in that battle that I've got listed here at the bottom. It was a motif that was of great interest to Jung, as I mentioned before, where the descent into the underworld of the unconscious, the domain of the open sea and the depths, activates the archetypal energies within the deep psyche that engage the world of comparative mythology. So you'll see here one of the images from Jung's Red Book, absolutely gorgeous book about his own active imaginations and dream life and the stories that went with them. And here is a sea journey with a boat which combines the iconographies of the Nordic world with a kind of Viking bow for the ship, and it is carrying a solar disk with the ram's horns derived from Egyptian mythology, in which the journey through the 12 hours of the night on a barge that floats up the Nile River is related to the journey of the pharaoh, Amun-Ra, the sun god that passes through the 12 hours of the night to be reborn the following dawn. And in Egyptian mythology, in the journey of Amun-Ra, there is typically an encounter between the pharaoh, the soul of the pharaoh, and the god, and the demons of the deep, the enemies of the pharaoh, who take the form in Egyptian mythology of a gigantic beast, dragon of the deep, called Apopthis. So here, underneath of the boat, in Jung's plate, you'll see an absolutely splendid variation on the theme of the sea monster of the deep that we know from, let's say, the belly of the whale in the story of Jonah. So right from the start, the iconography of the night sea journey becomes a basic metaphor established in the dream, with the boat leaving the marina on the west coast of Wales and moving out into the depths of the night sea and slicing through the dragon that generates the whirlpool. Here is another image of the night sea journey taken from the internet, and it shows a Chinese fisherman at night with a lantern in the bow, reflected in the depths of the river, in a very, very evocative image of the journey into the darkness of the unconscious. Now, I mentioned that the myth program is multidisciplinary and that it engages the study of literature, art history, religious studies, and so forth. So here is one example from the writings of Herman Melville from the book that I'm teaching now in the epic mythology class for the mythology program. And it's a wonderful passage that describes an event during one of the whale hunts where one of the whale boats is stranded and swamped at night and has to wait through a very long, anxious night to see if it will be rescued by the mother ship the next morning, the Pequod. And during the night, this marvelous character, Queequeg, stands in the bow of the boat holding a lantern that Melville calls an imbecile candle in the heart of that almighty forlornness. There then he sat, the sign and symbol of a man without faith, hopelessly holding up hope in the midst of despair. Relevant to the kind of disorientation and traumatic experiences that are often associated with the imagery of the night sea journey, which comes up in a wide range of literary texts relevant to the study of mythology. Now, as I mentioned in the dream, the symbolism of the whirlpool is at the heart of the action of the dream. The whirlpool generated by slicing through the sea serpent, and the whirlpool from which eventually the young woman will emerge from the foam and the blood of the drowning sailors. Now, the whirlpool, of course, is a numinous experience in the natural world, and it indicates the important connection between nature and the psyche. The archetypal energies are manifested not only in our dreams and in the unconscious, but of course in the natural world. These fields of energy relevant to the spiral and the whirlpool, which of course are absolutely fundamental to the conditions of our lives. We are on a planet that is spinning around its own axis at a rapid pace. And at the same time that it's spinning around its axis, it's rotating rapidly around the sun. And this generates the spiral imagery that characterizes many of the most fundamental archetypal structures of the natural world, which are also manifested in the forms of the dream and the deep psyche. So that there's a very thin boundary between the natural world and the human psyche. This is a dimension of reality that the Jungians call the psychoid, where the fundamental energies of the archetype manifest themselves sometimes simultaneously in the forms of the natural world and in the psychological imagery of the unconscious in the form of the dream. And in a way, the notion of the psychoid is at the heart of what Jung called synchronicity. So here's a beautiful image of the whirlpool that I would like to amplify with respect to mythological comparisons. And of course, the whirlpool is one of the great symbols that occurs throughout the course of human history. And you see it here in this old map of the unknown world off the coast of Europe. And you'll see the whirlpool in the center with a little boat in there that's being shipwrecked. And on the lower left, you'll see that affiliation between the whirlpool and this magnificent sea serpent that is coiled up around this ship in the lower left, reminding me of perhaps of Moby Dick and Moby Dick's attack or assault on the Pequod that leads to the sinking of the ship and the death of Captain Ahab. And in fact, in the background in the upper left, you'll see there, that's exactly what's happened to this unfortunate ship. A gigantic whale has attacked a boat and it is now sinking. And this is, of course, the great theme or plot of Moby Dick. But I want to emphasize this connection between the whirlpool, the shipwreck, and the dragon as relevant to my particular experience in the dream. and to amplify the image with reference to a wide range of mythological associations, such as the scene in Homer's Odyssey, which I also teach in the epic imagination class, when Odysseus, after a shipwreck, is threatened by the great whirlpool called Charybdis, which he manages to survive by clinging on to a piece of the boat and paddling over to a gigantic tree that hangs over the whirlpool. To illustrate that theme of the whirlpool in the Odyssey, I've taken this image from a contemporary graphic novel that tells the story of the Odyssey and relates it to the problem of the homecoming of the soldier and the post-traumatic stress syndrome connected to soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, from Vietnam, from World War II. And the Odyssey is one of the most profound explorations of the psychology of PTSD and the return of the soldier. So it couldn't possibly be a more relevant theme. So you'll see here this graphic novel illustrating the theme of Odysseus and the whirlpool. And it also illustrates an important principle of the mythological studies curriculum. And that is to try to explore the ways in which these mythological themes manifest themselves in the context of the contemporary world and are then shown to be so extremely applicable to the circumstances of our lives and to the emergence of new art forms like the graphic novel, the video game, films, and so forth. So here is the theme of the whirlpool of Charybdis from Homer's Odyssey in the form of the graphic novel. Now, another place to go to explore this in relationship not only to the whirlpool, but and the sea monster, but also to the imagery of the feminine. And in fact, the dynamic of a deeply repressed and buried form of the feminine that needs to be recovered and redeemed, not only in the psyche of a dream of a young 26-year-old man, but also in the culture itself, when it's so important to recover the dynamic of the feminine soul for the purposes of the redemption of the wasteland conditions that we are all urgently facing in our lives today. So another place to turn for the amplification of the iconographies of the dream is the domain of the folktale and its complicated relationship to the subject of myth. And that is a subject that we explore in the mythological studies program with a course devoted entirely to the folktale. One of the more recent examples of the folktale in relationship to myth is from the stories in the 19th century of Hans Christian Andersen. And this, of course, is a couple of images from the Little Mermaid. And it's quite a marvelous tradition of artistic representations of the folktale. So on the left here, you'll see the drowning sailor being taken down into the depths by this version of the sea monster, so to speak, in this absolutely magnificent octopus that has been introduced into the imagery of the folktale by the artist. And the artist of the folktale will often introduce elements that are interpretations that enrich the resonance of the original story. And here you'll see, of course, on the left, the imagery of descent, moving downwards, the night sea journey, the descent into the underworld of the unconscious, and the imagery of the feminine in the form of the Little Mermaid, who, on the right side of this image, you will see emerging from the whirlpool of the depths. rescuing the drowning prince. And you'll see here that again, the artist has introduced a key motif that constitutes a kind of interpretation or enrichment of the original story. And it's the imagery of the spiral related to the whirlpool that you'll see surrounding the little prince and the mermaid as they emerge from the depths of the sea. And if you take these two images together, you have the basic dynamic of the night sea journey of descent and return as the dynamic of the hero journey cycle of the night sea journey. This is not a very good image, but it does indicate the importance of the mythology and the folktale of the Little Mermaid in the contemporary world related to the domain of the Disney films. So you'll see here, again, this is a kind of interpretation with the Little Mermaid as here over the depths of the whirlpool in this connection between the feminine and the symbolism of the whirlpool. Now, I'd mentioned the arts, and they include not only film and literature, but the very rich reservoir of imagery associated with art history. And in the classes that I teach, I like to move all the way from the arts of classical antiquity and to the arts of the Neolithic and Paleolithic periods, all the way up through the history of art to the more contemporary manifestations of these themes in the postmodern world, such as this engraving by M.C. Escher, which illustrates the central archetypal symbolism associated with the spiral and the whirlpool and the sea in a very clever optical conundrum, which is characteristic of M.C. Escher's work, so that you can draw this spiral without lifting your pencil up off the page, moving from the left to the right for a centripetal and centrifugal spiral, spiraling inwards and spiraling outwards, with the clever motif of the red fish emerging from the depths of the spiral on my left and descending into the depths in the spiral on the right, while the gray fish are emerging from the spiral on the right and descending into the one on the left. And this complicated dynamic of the centripetal and centrifugal spirals, which is one of the great symbolism of world mythology. And there's a basic point of reference for this symbolism would be one of Joseph Campbell's important mentors, Ananda K. Coomaraswamy, the curator of the Oriental collection at the Boston Museum for many years. In a little article that Coomaraswamy wrote, published, extracted in a Parabola magazine called The One Thread. And he talks precisely about this image of the interlocking spirals that can be created by a single line written on a page. And he interprets that iconography from the point of view of religious studies with reference to Hinduism and the imagery as it occurs in Plato and Dante. And the basic point that he makes from the point of view of religious studies is that the dynamic is that of the journey of the soul, moving down in from the domain of the spirit into the material world, symbolized by the whirlpool that drags things downwards into the domain of the material world, and an image associated with birth or incarnation from the spirit to the flesh for the symbolism of the one spiral, and the other spiral related to the opposing dynamic of death with the return from the domain of the flesh and the material world to the domain of the spirit from which the soul has come. And those two taken together embrace the opposites of incarnation and transfiguration related to the journey of the soul, connecting the opposites of birth and death in a way that is characteristic of mythological images, which always embrace the opposites of the cosmos, male and female, life and death, day and night, and so forth. So the exploration of the religious or spiritual significance of the iconographies of dream and myth is at the heart of the mythological studies program, with courses, in fact, marvelous courses on Hinduism and Buddhism that would engage these iconographies. So the presence of these mythological images in the domain of the contemporary arts is one of the fundamental themes of the mythological studies program. Now, to move to other amplifications from the iconographies of the Greek world with the whirlpool of Charybdis, to the iconography of the folk tale in The Little Mermaid and the religious symbolism related to the whirlpool, let's explore the alchemical and hermetic associations relevant to the amplification of the dream and the sea serpent that occurs in the dream. So to do that, I've taken this image of the snake biting its own tail from a Hellenistic document of the Coptic period, which illustrates a recipe for making alchemical gold in a very important manuscript called the Codex Marcianus. And it's one of the manuscripts that I focus on in my class devoted entirely to the symbolism of alchemy and hermeticism in relationship to dream and myth. So you'll see here the symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake biting its own tail, and the colors are those associated with the dynamics of alchemical transformation, with the black, the green, the gold, and the red. And it brings to the dream this very important dynamic of creative transformation of raw materials. And the essence of deep psychological work through the engaging of the images of the unconscious is the transformation that occurs with the creative new developments that emerge and make it possible to find a new structure for the identity and the personality. So the alchemical motif we can imagine in this case, in the dream, a slicing through the dragon, the dismemberment of the dragon, which is a very important theme and image that occurs frequently in the kinds of alchemical images that I focus on in the class devoted to alchemy and hermeticism. So I'd like to explore that image now of what you might call the battle with the dragon and the dismemberment that occurs. And as I mentioned, it can be amplified with reference to a wide range of mythologies, including this creation mythology from the Faun people of Western Africa, in which the world is created by a rainbow serpent that travels across the world, creating the mountains and the ocean and the various topographical features of the landscape, and is frequently imaged biting its own tail in order to contain the energies of the creation. And it's a wonderful motif from the domain of African mythology, which is the subject of another class in the mythological studies program called African Traditions, when you can explore these iconographies in more detail. And here I'm simply focusing on the image of the serpent that bites its own tail, the rainbow serpent, and the way that those serpents become important symbols in such things as the great voodoo traditions of Haiti, with the Vevey signs relevant to the different Loa, the spirits that are manifested during the transpossession rituals of Haitian voodoo, which is also a subject that's explored more thoroughly in the African traditions class. So I have a couple of images of those serpents from that tradition of Haitian voodoo. Now, broadly speaking, the image of the dream in which the ship dismembers the sea serpent by slicing through it is relevant to the widespread distribution of the imagery of a battle with a monster or a dragon who is hoarding something. And this is an image, God's battle with the dragon, that can be amplified with reference to a wide range of mythologies, and they can be engaged from the perspectives of the depth psychological traditions of C.G. Jung. So here I've taken one of the very spectacular plates from Jung's Red Book, and it shows the mythology of Siegfried slaying the dragon Fafnir, which Jung knew not only from Wagner's Ring, which was a great phenomenon in the arts of Europe in the 19th and 20th century, but also from the old Germanic mythologies, the old Nordic mythologies, from which this great motif of the slaying of the dragon emerged. And large epic works like the Nibelungenlied and some of the Icelandic sagas. And you'll see here Jung's version of the slaying of the dragon, with Siegfried there in the center, slicing through the dragon and releasing a huge torrent of blood and the gold discs that come from the serpent, relevant to the myth as handled by Wagner, in which the dragon is in fact a giant named Fafnir, who has transformed himself into a dragon and stolen the Rhine gold, hoarded in a cave. And it's Siegfried's task, the young hero, to slay the dragon and to recover the Rhine gold, which is being hoarded by the dragon. And this is a motif that was very, very important for Jung during the crisis of his so-called confrontation with the unconscious in the second decade of the 20th century. And it comes up several times in the images that accompany the text in the Red Book. This is a little hard to see, but in the lower right there, you'll see the dragon of the deep, a kind of chrysalis butterfly over a cave on the left, and the imagery of the hero descending into the darkness to encounter the dragon in Jung's Red Book. Now, as I mentioned, this is a motif that is widely distributed in the mythologies of the Nordic world, Germanic, Scandinavian, Icelandic. And this is the door of a so-called stave church from Norway. These gorgeous churches. And it shows you Siegfried carved in wood, slaying the dragon. And it's a beautiful image from the stave church of this great theme. Another Nordic story, which involves the slaying of the dragon, is a story related to Thor. And you'll see here illustrated in this old Germanic manuscript with the runes. And it shows the story of Thor on a journey called Uthgard Loki. And here he has gone fishing for the world serpent, a gigantic serpent that marks the boundary between the known and the unknown world in the Nordic mythology. And this is important in the dream, as you remember, because it's just when the ferry boat is entering the open sea and into the darkness of the deep, into the world of the unknown, that the boat slices through the serpent to generate the whirlpool from which the young woman emerges. So here you'll see this image of Thor. He's tried to drag the sea serpent up from the depths. He's gone fishing for the serpent, using a huge ox head for bait. Excuse me. Another amplification, again, taken from literature to illustrate the theme of the battle with the monster of the deep, would be Melville's Moby Dick. Here's a graphic novel devoted to Moby Dick that illustrates the final catastrophic conclusion of the novel when the great white whale smashes up the Pequod and sinks the ship. And in many ways, one is greatly relieved that the monster wins the battle on this particular occasion, drowning the maniac, Captain Ahab, who is in pursuit of the white whale. So that motif from a stave church in Norway from the Middle Ages to a dream of Jung, and then 19th century battle with the monster in Moby Dick, and up to the current adaptations and applications of the myth in the domain of graphic novels and comic books. And this is an important subject. We have a class entirely devoted, a new class devoted to the graphic novel and comic books and mythology. It's a motif that we know is archetypal from a wide range of cultural associations, not only the Nordic and the literary, but also, of course, in the domain of Christianity, where you have the theme of St. George doing battle with the dragon, which is often a motif that one finds in the churches of old Europe. This is one of the most spectacular of all of the sculptures illustrating St. George slaying this absolutely splendid dragon here from church in old Europe. If we wanted to find an example of the mythology of the slaying of the dragon from the Greek world, it would be, among other things, the story of Perseus and Andromeda. And here you'll see Perseus riding on Pegasus, slaying the dragon, the sea serpent, the kraken, who has imprisoned Andromeda on this lonely island. And this brings to bear its relationship to the dream, because in the mythologies of the dragon is often hoarding something. It won't let go of something. It's either a gold or the tradition of the virgin, the female virgin, who symbolizes anima mundi, the soul of the world, which is trapped or imprisoned in the domain of the dragon, which is the material world of the sea. And the hero's job is to liberate the soul of the world from its imprisonment in the domain of the physical world. It's one of the great themes of the Gnostic traditions, which comes up in many times in the study of myth in the curriculum. This is the 19th century image of Perseus and Andromeda from the pre-Raphaelite painter Edward Burne-Jones, with a really a wonderful period in the history of English art in the Victorian era called the pre-Raphaelite painters, whose engagement with the subject of mythology, particularly the Arthurian mythologies, is a great subject to explore in the context of the curriculum of the myth program. Now, the central mystery, of course, in the dream is the emergence of this girl from the depths of the whirlpool, coming out of the whirlpool of foam and blood and the drowning sailors, and brought up onto the deck to be taken away by the crew and given a suit of clothing, the motif as it occurs in the dream. Now, one of the first associations or amplifications that many people have when sharing a dream like this has to do with the Greek mythology of the birth of Aphrodite, whose Roman name, of course, is Venus. So that's one of the great stories that is told by Hesiod in his book of about 750 BC, contemporary with Homer, called the Theogony. And it's in the Theogony that that Hesiod tells the great story of the castration of the sky god by his son, Kronos, and the genitals of the castrated father are thrown into the sea in Hesiod's story. And out of the blood and the semen and the foam of the severed genitals of the castrated father, the goddess of love is born, a Venus, Aphrodite. And she comes to shore to her island, Cythera, where she's greeted by her nymphs, who are bringing her an absolutely marvelous robe in the what we might call the Laura Ashley style of the flower print dresses that were so popular when I was younger. And this is the great example of the symbolism of clothing in the mythology of the birth of Venus, which comes up in my dream when the young woman from the whirlpool is taken away to be given a suit of clothing. And that's an important symbol in the Greek world with the stories of Aphrodite or Venus. And in those traditions, there are essentially two Aphrodites. One is the terrestrial Aphrodite with the mythology that has to do with her birth, and the other is the celestial Aphrodite, which has a different story for her birth associated with it. It's the subject of a painting by Titian somewhat later in the history of Renaissance art. Here is Botticelli's version from the 1400s related to the birth of Aphrodite in the context of the Italian Renaissance in the courts of Cosimo de' Medici, who hired a man named Ficino to translate the Platonic dialogues into Latin and develop an interpretation that synthesized the philosophies of Plato with the doctrines of Christianity. And this synthesis of Christianity and classical philosophy was one of the great achievements of the Florentine Renaissance in the circles of Cosimo de' Medici, the sponsor for this artist, Botticelli. And here you'll see that the artist has neglected to include the gruesome motif of the severed genitals of the father from which the goddess has emerged, but has emphasized the symbolism of clothing and the movement from the unconscious of the sea to the conscious world of the island, and the related iconography of the naked Aphrodite, symbolizing her spiritual form, the soul in a spiritual realm without physical form, to the clothed Aphrodite, representing the spirit of the world clothed in the material of the forms of the physical universe, symbolized by putting clothing on. And that is a wonderful dynamic in a wide range of mythologies that we explore in the myth program. So one could approach, therefore, the imagery of the dream as relevant to the birth or emergence of the goddess of love after the dismemberment of the sea serpent when the boat floats through it. And it would suggest if this were an analytical session, it would involve exploring the emergence of the deeply repressed image of the feminine and the connection to love in the psyche of the dreamer, as the goddess of love is born from the depths of a kind of a catastrophe with the castration of the father. And an analyst would explore those motifs in relationship to the life of the dreamer and see how they apply. if the analyst were a Freudian, there would be a lot more said about slicing through the sea serpent and the imagery of the castration, which would inevitably connect to the great symbolism in the Freudian world of the castration of the father that leads to the emergence of the feminine and the connection to the dynamic of the maternal realm, and how that would apply to the dynamics of the uh, growth and development of the young man. Here, the archetypal imagery of world mythology from the Jungian point of view suggests a deeper connection to a rich domain of images and the reservoir of archetypes that are brought into consciousness in the form of the dream, which can then be um, worked with to engage those energies in some significant way. Now, one needn't necessarily go into analysis for the psychological exploration of the mythological imagery in dreams. One can turn, of course, as I've tried to indicate, to literature, the arts, and music to amplify the iconography of the dream. And this is, in fact, what I did after having the dream at 26 years old, after having crossed the Irish Sea and having begun a 2-year program of creative writing, was to write a poem inspired by the dream and my recent study at the time of German and the folk ballad traditions related to German literature, so that I could bring into the conversation this wonderful ballad written by Heinrich Heine, one of the German Romantic poets of the 19th century, which was subsequently set to music so that I can engage the subjects of folk ballads, poetry, and music as a very rich response to the symbolism of the dream, which eventually led to a poem that I wrote called Die Lorelei. Here is another pre-Raphaelite painting illustrating the great theme in the Ballad of Die Lorelei, in which the feminine principle is represented by a beautiful woman who sits at the top of the Rhine cliffs, singing a mesmerizing song, a haunting song that lures passing ships to the shipwrecks at the base of the cliffs. So here is the drowning sailor, you might say, uh, uh, looking up at the Lorelei, singing at the top of the Rhine cliffs, in the form of the myth that I used for my poem, which I wrote for the first session of the creative writing program in Dublin that summer many, many years ago. And I introduced this subject of poetry and creative writing because it also involves another critical aspect of the myth curriculum, and that is the option that we have when it comes to the dissertation of what we call a production piece, where the great bulk of the dissertation is not an academic exploration of the subject, but a creative project, like a new book of poems or a collection of folk ballads, or the creation of a graphic novel, or a film script, or a video game. We've had all of these things in the form of dissertations in the past several years. In those for those students who choose to move in that direction of the performance piece, not all students by any stretch of the imagination. Many of the students will proceed and write a very traditional academic PhD dissertation as the focus for their work. But we do have this really wonderful, unique option, which kind of bridges the PhDs in creative writing with those of mythological studies. So this is the poem that I wrote in Dublin in 1976, and it had an unexpected and an important development in my life when I shared the imagery of the dream and the poem related to Delorelei. Now, here again, as I mentioned, I like to bring the subject up to date if I can, moving from the pre-Raphaelite paintings of the Victorian era up to the postmodern world with the arts in Germany of an absolutely amazing artist named Anselm Kiefer, a post-World War II, post-Holocaust German artist of enormous importance. And he was very deeply engaged with various mythological traditions related to German culture. So here you'll see the image that he created that he calls Die Lorelei. You can see the writing at the top of the engraving there, and a multimedia piece that is produced by pouring molten lead on a photographic plate. And in this case, at the bottom, you'll see the Rhine cliffs and the sea, and then the image of the rebarb and concrete of the ruins of a building, such as you might find in Germany after the war, and its connection to the mythological traditions of Die Lorelei. So the whole subject of the presence of mythological imagery in the contemporary arts is a hugely important one for the curriculum of the myth program at Pacifica. Now, as I mentioned, this experience of sharing the dream and producing a poem and engaging the subject of comparative mythology is one that had profound impact on my life, as it does in any life that engages the deep energies of the psyche, which have a dynamic of creative personal transformation that leads to new directions in one's life. And this was the case with me when I shared the dream and the poem with my friend from Maryland. And the next day, she brought a book down the hall from the hostel where we were staying outside of Dublin and said, you know, you need to read this book. And the book that she gave me was Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. And then the next day, she brought a book down the hall, which was Campbell's edition of the Portable Jung, and said, you need to read this section on the devouring mother archetype. I didn't have a clue who Joseph Campbell was. I didn't know who Jung was. I didn't know what a devouring mother archetype was. But all of this came in the form of the dream. And as a result, I engaged in a period of deep reading in Campbell's work that led eventually, at the end of the 2-year period in Dublin and London, to a trip in northern France, where the same friend brought me a little brochure about a trip in northern France, focusing on the Grail romances of the Middle Ages. So the next thing I know, instead of flying back to JFK, I'm getting on a bus outside of Charles de Gaulle Airport and sitting with Joseph Campbell on a trip that would take us all around northern France, focusing on the Grail romances. And that trip is the subject of another presentation devoted to a kind of a memoir that is devoted to the trips that I took with Joseph Campbell in France, and then the following year in Egypt and Africa. And really that changed my life, and the whole dynamic of my life shifted as a result of the engagement with the dream. And out of that dream came a new life for me. It's one that I've been pursuing for many years now in my publications and teachings, devoted to the mythology of the Night Sea journey, which I call the Nekia, or the descent to and return from the underworld. So this is the first in a series of presentations that I'm working on related to dream, myth, and the arts. So I'm going to stop the share at this point and encourage you to record any impressions or questions or related associations that you might have with reference to the studies in mythology at Pacifica from an interdisciplinary point of view, embracing poetry, the arts, music, religious studies, and so forth. Whatever questions you might have, I'd be happy to talk more with you about that. But I'm going to end this first installment of a sequence of lectures on dream and myth, and hope to see you for the second round. So thank you very much.